Hello, we've finally reached the Renaissance. After much travailing through the Dark Ages and the Middle Ages in literature, we're ready for that flourishing again. We're ready to put a lot of the Renaissance figures in a much better context now that we've gone through the Dark Ages, through the epic, Anglo-Saxon poetry, Alfred, Boethius, gone through the Middle Ages now as well. And just to cement or finalise Middle Ages, we need to put together a Middle Ages reading list. I did this with the Dark Ages in number 5 of this series, so I'm going to do a similar thing with the Middle Ages. The scope's getting a bit bigger now. Dark Ages is focused on the Homeric epics, and then comparing that with Beowulf, a few of the Anglo-Saxon works, and Boethius' Consolation of Philosophy was quite important. You can go back to video number 5 to check that out. But in terms of a Middle Age reading list, what we've had since then, we actually didn't have a few big players in that Dark Age reading list that you would think a much needed core to any classical reading list. We're going to pretty much solidify that now. We're not going to dive into everybody yet, but we're going to do a few more core ones, namely the big 3 Roman ones. Now, in Ovid, the big epic, he calls it an epic, doesn't really fit the epic mold, but his epic is the Metamorphoses. It's about a 300 plus page book when you have an Oxford University Press version of it. It's got 15 books within it. You know, we talked about Homer has 24, Ovid's Metamorphoses has 15. And then you should also be getting Ovid's Art of Love. Why? Because we talked before about how Ovid in the Middle Ages is such a crucial character. Really did fit in with the style and that sort of mischievous takes on love could really graft onto the courtly romances of the Middle Ages, such as the Romance of the Rose. So we've got Ovid's Metamorphoses and the Art of Love next to Romance of the Rose. They're must-reads. Also, Hyatt says that the 2 other core texts of the Middle Ages are Dante's Divine Comedy and Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. So they need to be added to the list as well. Dante's Divine Comedy, you have options of what sort of translation you would want. Do you want a parallel text one is probably quite good, but there's nothing wrong with, say, Clive James's translation, which came out quite recently. It's not in the Terzarima. So the Terzarima is how Dante actually wrote it, and it goes A, B, A, B, C, B, D, C, D, and so on, all the way through, interlocking triplets of a rhyming technique, the Terzarima. Clive James's translation doesn't follow that. A lot of translations do follow that, but there's a debate on whether or not it's as impactful in English as it is in Italian, or whether there's the same rhythm and flow to the language. So Clive James does not do that. He does a more standard A, B, C, D, C, D, so on, getting quatrains going. It's perfect as an introduction. I have no objection. I read Clive James's one and it was fine. Oxford University Press has one by, I'm just going to get it up here, by C.H. Sisson. It's the one you see from Oxford University Press in most stores. I believe it's fine. I've known people who've read it. I think it has the parallel. If it has the parallel, then that's a huge bonus for it. Now, we have Ovid, and then we have the 3 core Middle Ages texts. Dante's Divine Comedy, Romance of the Rose from France, and then Chaucer's Canterbury Tales from England. Canterbury Tales, I think you should bite the bullet and go with the original text one, which it looks like this, and is this thick, yes. The reason being because a lot of this is footnotes. The footnotes begin here. So a substantial, 30% of it? And they're very, very good, very informative, and help you get through it. So I wouldn't get bogged down in some of the language you see, but you're reading the authentic thing, and then the footnote is what gives you all of the context you need. It works just as well as reading a translation, except now you have the authentic text. And then that leaves us with the two Italian figures that we saw, namely Petrarch and Boccaccio. In Boccaccio, you again have a choice of. You probably got to get the Decameron, although it's not his most classical of works. It is his seen as his magnum opus, and it is the one you're going to find everywhere. You're going to struggle to find. You're going to struggle to find his Theseid. You're going to struggle to find Philostrata, so on. You got to get to the Decameron, and then you have a choice of translations. The Penguin Classics one is by George Henry McWilliam, which I have. And again, this is quite thick. It's about, I don't have it with me at the moment, but it's about this similar thickness to that. Maybe it's slightly thinner. You're talking over 500 pages. And then your other option is the Oxford University Press one. I'm giving options that are quite readily available. That's by Guido Waldman. Personally, I wouldn't get bogged down on this. I would just get one of them. And then the Decameron, as we know, is 10 different tales over 10 days. So don't feel overawed by it. Similar to Canterbury Tales. We can dip and dive into these. Canterbury Tales is important to get the Knight's Tale out, certainly. And then the Decameron, you can dip and dive in and out of them. I haven't read the Decameron cover to cover yet, so don't feel too obliged to, but it's important to have some Boccaccio on your shelf. That leaves us with Petrarch. Petrarch is difficult because we really want an Africa, or we want something around his Latin works that are very much so a classical rendering. What we find everywhere instead is the Canzoniere. And as a compromise, I think it's a good place to start with this very thin one you get from Oxford University Press from Petrarch. It's called A Section from the Canzoniere and Other Works. What are the other works? Well, they're just some collections of his letters. There's a letter to posterity, which is actually quite good, and the Ascent of Mount Ventoux, which is meant to be this ascent he had in France, in which he got visions about how he was going to be a classicist and so on. And then it has a decent selection from the Canzoniere. This is by Marc Moussat, who also has translations in this, The Essential Petrarch. This is to just fill you up a bit more with Petrarch. It doesn't have any of his Africa, which was originally written in Latin anyway, so it would be a translation. But what it does have is The Triumph of Eternity, and it also has a section from the Secretum, Book 3, which is Petrarch's secret dialogues with Augustine and some of the older, more classical figures. That does lead you to the opportunity to perhaps have some Augustine on your shelf as well. Petrarch's Secretum is similar to Augustine's Confessions in its own way, so perhaps the Confessions will be a bit of a more digestible Augustine to have on your shelf than The City of God, which is quite a thick book. And then finally, the last one you should have from the Middle Ages is Cicero. Not from the Middle Ages, but part of your Middle Age reading list. It's difficult to know where to begin with Cicero because his works are so extant. But I would go with these three. What we've got here is the Republic and the Laws. And these are quite thin. They're about 200 pages each. And his political speeches I've got there. And then I've got an Introducing Cicero, a Latin Reader, which is a nice one to put some of his speeches into context. In addition to these, there's also the defense speeches. Some of the defense speeches come up in this. They're not in this. They're in a book by Oxford University Press called Defense Speeches rather than Political Speeches. Similar size, maybe even a bit thinner. What you mainly want to get, if all of this is too much Cicero for you, is simply this one, the Republic and the Laws, and you want to get to Book 5, where Cicero talks about the dream of Scipio, which came up as a big inspiration for Petrarch, but also an inspiration for Chaucer. So that is your Middle Age reading list. So to begin with the Renaissance, we need to look at chapter 6, the Renaissance and translation in the Renaissance. I'm going to experiment with just showing you the parts of this chapter just as a different means of getting through what Hyatt is talking about. So we can see here he begins with the three channels of classical influence, which he calls translation, imitation, and emulation. And that is really the progress chart that Renaissance thinkers are going to go with beginning in the Renaissance. So you need to start with translation. By the time they reach emulation, it could take a few more centuries to get to that point, because they're rediscovering these ancient writers, rediscovering these techniques. So you translate the techniques, you imitate the techniques yourself on your own sort of stories, and then eventually you can emulate them, as in you're free from them, but you're emulating them. You can see here he begins in the idea of translation to 250 BC, with Livius Andronicus turned Homer's Odyssey into Latin. The Roman literature and Roman thought, these were the noblest when all educated spoke and wrote Greek as well as Latin. That's an interesting point. The Romans themselves were at their best when they had translated and known the Greek. That's a critical point in understanding Roman culture. And we need a similar thing to now occur in Europe. By the 14th century in France, there was a deliberate policy of borrowing words to increase the scope of their own language. Mainly, and they wanted to include this into the achievements of Charles V in France, who had a protege in enacting his will in Niccolo Oresme, who was a translator at the French court in the 14th century. Words taken from Latin and Greek fell into two main classes: abstract nouns and technical artistic phrases. You can see here's Oresme. And the former, you have examples like circulation, décision, hésitation, calamité, spécialité, arriérant, évidence. And then the latter, class 2, technical artistic phrases, are acte, artiste, démocratie, facteur, médecine. So we can see the impact of translation was already afoot before we really get to the Renaissance proper around certain terms such as these. Latin had also persisted throughout the church, and we know English came under the Latin influence through that French connection. Despite the impact we talked of the 100 Years' War in England, and its split with identifying with France, the cultural osmosis had still occurred. We know Chaucer would have translated Boethius, so he would have known Latin, and certain important terms like an orator or an astrologer would have come from Latin. In Spanish, ambition, commendación, servitude, all coming from Latin as well. And then finally, as a Latin influence, we have the Ciceronian Tricholon as an influence in speech. We can see this here. It is an arrangement of words or phrases in groups of 3 and comes from Cicero. Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg Address is the most obvious of these. He talks of government of the people, by the people, for the people. And by the time we get to Gibbon later, some of this will have become a little bit stale, a little bit perhaps too routine, too formulaic. But right now, in the Renaissance, these sort of terms and these sort of translations were new and fresh. So we get to the main crux then of the chapter, which is really an overview of what was translated. And this is why I've gone for this sort of technique, so we can see how Hyatt has classified them. We can see here then he begins with the epic. And he begins with Homer. The Iliad. Okay, well, it's gone into Spain, Spanish in 1445. It's gone into English through George Chapman, Chapman's Homer, being a very famous translation. 1611, the Odyssey, in 1614, and the hymns in 1616. It was prose translation of Virgil's Aeneid in Gaelic before 1400, Imeachta Aeneasha, in the Book of Ballymote. That's quite an interesting one, but really it is an isolation before the main things. We're talking about English translations. Chapman's Homer there is a key one. The mid 1500s is a large time of translation for French. The Odyssey, we got Jacques Pelletier du Monde gives his Odyssey in 1547. The Aeneid, Guillaume Leroy's Aeneid, had been in the 15th century, already in French. We also have some important French translator names, Jacques Amiot and Joachim du Boulay. Here's the French translator Jacques Amiot, who rose from a professorship at Bourges to be a bishop of Auxerre, and issued his magnificent complete version of the Lives of Plutarch, is what we're on here. So we've moved off the epic into history. Herodotus gets translated, Thucydides gets translated, Xenophon, Plutarch. These are all the names you should know. And you can see also in sort of pseudo-epic, we had also had Lucan and Ovid. Lucan's is the Pharsalia, or an epic on the civil wars in Rome. Sallust and Caesar are translated. One of the most important translations of Plutarch's Parallel Lives is that in English of Thomas North, 1579. That inspires Shakespeare and helps Shakespeare he obtains such a copy of it, which gives him inspiration for a Coriolanus, a Mark Antony and Cleopatra, and also Julius Caesar. You also have parts of Livy coming through in this century, beginning to be translated properly, as well as Tacitus. Of course, Livy, we never really have the complete works of Livy, so it's always dribs and drabs that it comes in. His then known works get translated for instance, into English by Philemon Holland in 1600. Tacitus, by way of Henry Saville, 1591, the Histories and Agricola of Tacitus. Then we move on to translations in philosophy. Translations in philosophy include all of that of Plato. The complete works were translated into Latin from Greek in 1482 by Ficino, which is quite an important one, because then once you're in Latin, a lot of people can get it from Latin back into their own vernacular. Lois Leroy in France loved translating a few of them: Phaedo, Symposium, The Republic. We also have Aristotle being translated. The Politics goes to French by Lois Leroy, 1568. Nicolas Resme, as we talked, had already done the Politics in 1486. The Ethics also goes into French in the 16th century. Plutarch's moral essays come into the fore in the 16th century. Examples include 4 moral essays going into English by Bouteville in 1558 to 61. Complete moral essays are in German in 1535. Jacques Amiot does complete moral essays into France in 1572. And then we get Cicero's On Friendship and on Old Age, also getting translated. Remember, Petrarch was an early scholar on Cicero, so he was quite important in finding some of these manuscripts. Now the manuscripts are getting translated into French, Italian, German, and English. Seneca's letters are also getting translated. We can see their fragmentary works in the Dream of Scipio coming through as well in the 1560s. In drama, we have, which is quite an important one, because we haven't really mentioned much of drama so far. But in drama, we have a Sophocles, we have Euripides. Euripides' Hecuba, Medea, Iphigenia at Aulis, all into Italian in the 1540s to 1550s by Ludovico Dolce. They go to Spanish, they go to French by Amiot again. It's Hecuba in 1544, for instance. We have Aristophanes getting translated into, for instance, French by Ronsard in 1550. So really, we're slap bang in the middle of the 16th century with all these floods of translations coming through. Plautus was a favourite. The court poets of Ferrara, translating his comedies as early as 1486. Ferrara and the court of Ferrara was very important in the early transmission of the Renaissance drama. And we're going to talk about Renaissance drama next after this. So Terence and Plautus are the 2 Roman dramatists of comedy, which is quite important at this age. And then the dramatic translation of Seneca's works also came through in this time. 10 Tragedies into English, for instance, between 1559 and 1581. Quite an influential publication. Oratory, as we talked about with the Ciceronian Tricholon, was also quite important. Here's some orators that haven't really come up yet. You have Demosthenes, the Olympiacs, Socrates, To Nicoles, Duties of the Monarch. A lot of these old oratories would be used by the likes of a Machiavelli in justifying and how to write prose is the way to be influential over both your reader and then also over as guidebooks to the readers. Cicero's speeches, Marcellus, some others. Then we have smaller works. Aristotle's Poetics, quite influential. Didn't really come true until this time. Into Italian in 1549 by Bernardo Segni, quite an important one. And then added commentary by 1570 by the likes of Castelvetro. So Aristotle's Poetics came true quite late, but are important coming true into the 17th century on the cusp of that change. Theocritus, whose Idylls are important in pastoral translations. Lucian, these are all Greek, and hence why they were coming true a bit later than the Latin. Daphnis and Chloe, Ethiopica, these are more obscure romances. Cicero's other correspondence coming true, Virgil's Bucolics, Georgics, Horace's Odes, which become quite an influential part of the classical tradition for English, the upper English class in the 19th century. Churchill was a great fan of Horace's Odes. Of its minor works, Persius, Pliny, Martial, Juvenal, the satirist, Apuleius' Metamorphoses, sometimes known as the Golden Ass. And it closes chapter 6 with this little passage here that I've highlighted that as an example of the importance of translation and how it affects people. So Amiot, Jacques Amiot, one of the famous French translators, he translates the Greek biographer and moralist Plutarch into French. Montaigne seizes on the translation and lives with it for the rest of his life. North turns Amiot's translation into English. Shakespeare changes it into the Coriolanus, the Antony and Cleopatra, the Julius Caesar. Great books, in Milton's words, are the lifeblood of a master spirit. So that is the translations of the Renaissance. Next, we're on to chapter 7 here, Renaissance drama. We'll finally get to talk about the Greek tragedians and comedians along with the Roman ones. Names we've really all covered there in translation, but we're going to cover their effect now in drama.